And hello to you all in the room. Thanks for your patience, for bearing with us. We have more than 200 folks registered to attend remotely, but the Monhegan Island community is our focus for this very special event with a special guest. And I'll turn it over to our board chair, Adam.
Great. Thank you so much, Will. And I'm going to be very brief here, but just have to say good evening. Welcome. I'm Adam Blumenthal, I'm chair of the Monhegan Museum of History. And so just a couple of moments, maybe everybody knows all of the context of why they're here, but from the perspective of the museum, let's take just a couple of moments to say thank you. For this is going to be an incredible conversation between our own Dr. William Coleman, who's both board member of the museum and director of the Deci Lecture Series Center, and Professor Wanda M, who is the Robert and Ruth Halford Professor Emerita of Art History at Stanford. And Professor Korn's remarks are going to inaugurate the Edward L. Deci Endowed Lecture Series, which honors the contributions that Ed, our founding president and director, has made to the island community and to the museum over his nearly 40 years involved in the museum and the community. So, Dr. Korn is a founder, really, of the field of American art history, and has taken a historian's approach to studying and understanding art in physical and spatial contexts. Among other accomplishments, that's resulted in the creation of the Historic Artists Homes and Studios program in National Trust for Historic Preservation. And of course, one of our own properties at the museum, which is known as the Kent Fitzgerald Studio, is a part of that program. And there is a perspective, right, that we should refer to that as the Kent Stoddard Fitzgerald Studio, since Alice Stoddard actually used that studio longer than either Rockwell Kent or James Fitzgerald. And the omission of her name from the official title of the building probably is part of the kind of historical context and awareness in the context in which art takes place. It was remembered that Dr. Korn's scholarship over the last since the 1960s has helped illuminate for everybody. And I just really want to say on behalf of the museum that more broadly, right, this entire island kind of is a historic artist's home and studio, right? It's a very small place, right? Every stretch of road, right? Every garden, right? Every cliff, every rock, sometimes it seems like, has been chronicled. Every house has either housed, fed, or nurtured an artist. And sometimes, as you walk around, you have to decide if you're seeing things with your own eyes or through the eyes of somebody who painted that 10 years ago or 100 years ago. And so because of the history and the context in which the art of this island takes place, I think Dr. Korn's approach, so historically, will be particularly illuminating to all of us. And with that, I think I'm just going to turn it over to Will, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks to all of you who are here in the room on Monhegan Island, bathed in the light of a golden sunset over the Gulf of Maine. And thank you to the 124 people on live as we finagle island internet to start a little behind schedule. Thanks for your patience. We are so pleased to be here in person in the Monhegan Schoolhouse with somebody who has given so much to the field of art history in general, and to one piece of that story that has a particular impact on Monhegan Island, which is thinking about how an artist's environment can help us to understand our shared cultural legacy, to understand layers of a place in ways that a painting in isolation cannot. I have learned so much. I am the product of this person's vast impact on the field of art history. So it's always a privilege to get to learn from her live. Every time we talk, I learn something new. You get a little sense of where we might be going in 3 three artist environments here, with the one that I hope will be familiar to many of you at right. We will come full circle to Monhegan at the end. Professor Wanda saw the Kent Fitzgerald House and Studio for the first time today. So we're going to get very fresh responses to all of that. But we are conscious that we are here because of the huge impact of this man in the front row, Professor Edward L. Deci, who built this wonderful community-focused museum into a really important repository of American art that talks about that contribution, that passion changed my life. Perhaps it's impacted many of yours as well. And so we start something new here, bringing voices from a wider field, people who've intersected with Monhegan in their careers to share what they've learned and to bring us new insights into this special place we all love. I thought it would be best to start, Wanda, with the big picture. We could phrase it, why do artist houses matter?
Well, let me just first thank you, Ed, for all that you have done for art on this island, but also just the amazing creation of this museum and making art matter, not only on Monhegan Island, but for those of us that study American art more broadly. So I'm delighted to be here and to see again what you've achieved on the island. I think we're going to be quite autobiographical tonight. And then I'm going to talk about why or how I began to think about artists' homes as mattering, as being worth saving and preserving and telling their stories. So I think I'm going to let you go further, but I will just point out that the two pictures unidentified here, one is Grant Wood's studio, man who created American Gothic, and he's been the subject of much of my research. And that's Georgia O'Keeffe's home in Abiquiu, New Mexico, that's in the middle. We're coming back to those, so need not say anything more. But maybe we move to the next picture, which I think gets us going on at least my little bit of autobiography. Yeah, when I got thinking about coming here, I thought, well, which house do I start with? I probably should really start with Grant Wood, but we'll get there in a second. And I do think that the first couple of homes that I was in that have something to do with Maine and with a Maine artist, a Maine East Coast artist, and that was Andrew Wyeth. I put an exhibition of his work together in 1973. And in order to do that exhibition, I had to come to work with the Wyeths, Mrs. Wyeth in particular, had vital records to look at. And I visited them in their two homes at the time, which the one in Chadds Ford on the left, which is sometimes called the mill because it used to be a working mill on a rather ferocious body of water, creek, that was a power source. And then the home that they had at that point in Cushing, we're way before island culture or island madness took on, the Wyeths got involved with, particularly Mrs. Wyeth. So it was in Cushing that I saw these two environments. And I was very impressed with we won't spend much time on these because these are not open to the public and so on, but they were very distinctive interiors. And I remember thinking in that my family tended to be kind of messy and lots of tchotchkes around and, pictures of family on tables and so on. And this was such clean cut environments. They kind of looked like Andrew Wyeth's paintings. And so I was kind of struck by the harmony, if you will, of the setting within the house and the harmony of the aesthetic that the artist that we know, Andrew Wyeth, to have been. So I think it did make a small impress at the time, but I didn't really register right then and there what I would now register so much more strongly, which is that very often, not always, but very often the homes and workspaces of artists are a creative work of art, or at least contribute in a way that we can learn about their creativity if we visit their material structure. So that's how it all started. My next big moment was when in the early 1980s, I resurrected the career of Grant Wood, who was an artist of the 1930s. You know him best for American Gothic, but Daughters of American Revolution. He was standing in front of that painting in the picture we had earlier. He's from Iowa. Cedar Rapids, Iowa is where he lived first, and then in Iowa City. And he had two artist homes there. And in order, his career was totally understudied at that point. And so I had to basically go to his homes and try to dig around and meet people and talk to people who had known him and so on. And everybody kept saying, well, you've got to see the studio. You just got to see the studio home. And they were referring to this space, but they're referring to that brick building that you see here on the left. That is the an outbuilding to a large mansion that is behind it, that was turned into a funeral home during Grant Wood's stay in Cedar Rapids in the 1920s. And the funeral home director saw in Grant Wood a sort of cleverness with materials and interest in design, and not bad even as an amateur architect, and hired him to do some interior decorating of the home to make it, to turn it into a professional funeral facility. And he got interested in Grant Wood because he was, first of all, not doing well financially. He was taking care of his mother. He was the sole the sole breadwinner for his mother, and sometimes his one of his siblings, his sister. And he was having to basically teach school in order to make a living. So long story short, he said to the funeral director's name, David Turner, said to Grant Wood, would you like to take the top of this old stables behind the funeral home, the second floor, and make it into a studio for yourself? Because he had no place to make his work. Well, what did he eventually said, not only do I want to make it into a studio, but I want to live there. And so it's kind of a loft style space, but tight. I don't have the external dimensions on my head, but you can see that, and we don't have a pointer, but over there where you see a bench, there a table can pop in there and become the breakfast table. It can also be made into a bed. It's sort of like a boat. Everything had 2 or 3 functions. Those 2 doors to the right of the fireplace would open up and become cabinets and places where things were stored for meals. Things could be passed from over that counter and so on. Very cleverly put together. And I learned something immediately from this space, which is I wasn't dealing just with a painter. I was dealing with somebody who could work in 3 dimensions, who knew how to work with metal. He knew how to figure out how to take an old metal kettle and cut it in half and make it the hood for the fireplace. And he taught some of his students how to do punched metal, to do decorative work to hide some of the cabinetry there on the left. And in this little modest space, and he had his mother do the rugs for the floor. So everybody got involved. And it was just one big open space that could be turned into, there was a bathroom tucked away in the back, where beds would come out at night and then beds would disappear during the day and become a studio. It was quite an adventure in multi-purpose living. And he would even invite people in. He had one end of it he made into a stage because he liked to do community theater. They got worried about too much weight on the floor and that had to disappear, and the community theater had to go elsewhere. But he was sort of a master of many trades. And once I began to understand that, it unlocked his career for me in ways that I won't go into anymore. But just to say, I couldn't have done it had I not seen this house. And I saw it at that time when it was being rented out to a young artist. Eventually, it became a property open to the public. You too can go to Cedar Rapids and see where American Gothic was painted. But it was also the site of something quite amazing. This modest space was, in fact, where this painting happened. So that really turned me on to thinking about artist homes. And then my third little moment is a story which about an artist I suspect most of you in this room would never have heard of, because she is not a textbook figure. Her name was Alice Pike Barney, and she was a turn of the 19th into the 20th century woman of some means in Washington, D.C., who thought that government was doing all right in DC, but culture was nowhere. She thought, and she was right, this is all pre-Smithsonian, pre-Phillips collection, and there was no dance, there was no music, and she wanted to be kind of the mover and shaker to bring culture to DC, and she herself had aspirations to become a painter. That's a self-portrait she did of herself, not bad at all, there in the lower right. And here she is as a hostess in a home that she built, which is called Barney House. And this home which has a flat facade, had this extraordinary single space on the floor, the second floor, in which she would do all these multiple events. She would have concerts there. Ruth St. Denis danced there. She would have parties, but also she would have all kinds of what we would call kind of arts lectures and communications that she was trying to introduce people that were performing in New York. She was trying to bring them to Washington, D.C. and give them a place where they could perform. And she had windows done by Tiffany-like figures, beautiful tiles by Mercer Tiles, which was a very important kind of arts and crafts provider, and so on and so on. In any case, I lived with my husband, Joe, down here in the front row. We lived in the top 2 stories, which is where the bedrooms were, because the Smithsonian always put a fellow, somebody having a fellowship there, up there as a security system. They owned this building. And why did they own it? They owned it because when their mother died, she had 2 daughters, Natalie Barney, whom some of you may know is the lesbian poet of Paris in the 1920s, wrote the first amongst the first poems that were quite vividly written as love poems, woman to woman. And her second daughter, Laura Barney, became an advocate and a scholar of Eastern religions. In any case, these 2 women neither had children, and they gave to the Smithsonian in 1961 this home, all their mother's paintings, and a good deal of the furnishings. And it was open to it was restored, preserved, and open to the public, and her story began to be told by docents. We were there in '86, and around, I don't know, in the early 90s, I began to hear rumblings that the Smithsonian was going to sell this building. And we had grown enchanted with the oddity of this domestic space, which was half given over to public event spaces. Very little bit put into bedrooms and parlors and the conventional spaces at the time. And at the time, I thought, I just can't believe that the Smithsonian is going to divest of this work. And I researched as best I could and learned that she had this whole idea is really based on ideas that she'd gotten from Whistler, whom she idolized and went over and studied with in both Paris and in London. And that Whistler had strong ideas about artist homes and the way in which they should promote art, not just be the place where you laid your head. And she had brought those ideas to this country. There were 2 or 3 other structures I learned that had come along with the same idea, but none of them had been ever maintained and put into the public domain. So that's where it all happened. When I learned that this painting, this home was going to be sold, I thought that this was kind of a crime against art history, culture, and a number of other people joined the campaign to try to at least preserve the home in some way that it still served art history and was open to the public. Long story short, this building is the Latvian embassy. So, i.e., we failed. The Smithsonian sold the building. And the Latvians are very kind to it, but it is no longer the kind of extraordinary space, one of a kinder space that this country could boast of if it were still there. In other words, they do let you, however, walk through the front door and look at it if you say that you're there on a mission to see the space. But this is what got me going, but also got me talking to other people about saving spaces like this. And this I learned from talking to the National Trust. I went, the National Trust is our biggest nonprofit organization that preserves historic buildings in this country. It at one time got federal funding. It does not today. It lives off its endowments and it lives off fundraising and all kinds of ways of having us work hard to scrap together budgets every year to save buildings across the country of all sorts. And I went to them immediately thinking they're just down the street, their headquarters are. Wouldn't they want to save this building? Well, they had a pretty good answer. They already had a couple of buildings by wealthy women around circa 1910 and in cities. And so this did not bring a distinction as far as they were concerned. And furthermore, did I have an endowment for it? You know, they're asked some rather serious financial questions on, but I got talking with them. And I talked particularly, and I have to name Frank Sanchez was his name, who was a very visionary administrator. And he and I went out and looked at a couple of other properties, and I began to use some spare time to just find out what this country was doing about preserving artists' homes and studios. And you know, I found them here and there, and I found out that they were usually local, just like your situation here. They were local salvaged properties. Somebody loved them, somebody saved them, somebody kept their stories alive, but they had no way of talking and knowing of anybody else that was doing the same thing in another community. There was no networking. So long story short, what's our next set of pictures? Do we
get into what became of this? So yeah, there's I hear a beautiful story of recognition, discovery, and insight from the Grant Wood story, and then activation that these structures are threatened, and that somebody has to do something about this. And Wanda was that somebody who decided to do something.
Well, not alone. I fear that I get too much a sort of origin story glamour out of all this. Because there were other people involved, and the trust, I have to say, realizing that maybe there was a story here that could be told if there was in fact a membership organization. And that's what this is, an old map, and I know my friends at Haas, as we call it, and this is an old brochure. They're just squirming because the up-to-date one is right here, our audience. And that's sort of 36 sites, and we are today 55 and counting. Across the map. But what it does help you see is that what was organized 23 years ago and has really begun to flourish in the last decade was a network of artists' homes and studios that were not only preserved, but were open to the public, and were teaching people about the history of this country's art. Their logo is Witness Creativity. They're artists of all sorts: painters, sculptors, furniture makers, and they're all across the country. And the National Trust is the home for what we call HAAS, Historical Artists' Homes and Studios. It does not own these properties. These properties are owned by foundations. They're owned sometimes by private concerns. They're owned occasionally by a university. Now, several museums own them, so that they have different patterns of ownership and administration. But the one thing they have in common is that they are open to you and me to go see at least some of the time, some portion of the year, and learn from and experience. So that's a way of us telling you what Haas is today. And it's run out of the National Trust, but it's basically, if you will, I like to think of it as the National Park Service for visual creativity in this country. The only problem with that is that the National Park Service gets federal funding and we do not. But it is that idea that we make visible, this organization makes visible in ways that no other organization does, the way creativity ripples and works and operates across the country, and can be experienced by you and me on public visits.
It's a really powerful thing to have a kind of an overarching umbrella, a structure, a network for communication between these very different places. And I know Wanda wants to share a quick overview, some glimpses of many of these properties. We should say out loud what I think is already understood, that the Monhegan Museum of Art and History is a steward of one of these member sites, and that is that pin that is floating way too far off the coast here. The Rockwell Kent, Alice Kent Stoddard, James Fitzgerald House and Studio. So it is really exciting for Monhegan to be a part of that wider conversation. It helps people coming up in the field in Wanda's wake to understand this as a phenomenon that is important and distinct and widespread. One larger conversation would be, is this distinct to the United States?
Yes, that's a great question. You know, what do other countries do with their creative dwellings and past history told, where history can be told through domestic environments and workspaces. I would say that this country has not been great at this. We've left it to the locals. There's never been kind of a national understanding or policy about these properties having value to preserve and save, but also teach, to teach us our history. How many of you have been to, I'll just throw out, how many have been to Monet's Giverny? Few, yes. Now we'll try this one. How about Rembrandt in Amsterdam? A couple. Rubens in Antwerp. Delacroix in Paris. Yeah, okay, there are 3 or 4 of us. Good. Villa Stuck in Munich. 2. Thanks. In any case, I would say Europe has been way ahead of us in recognizing these properties as important and preserving them and making them making sure that they were saved, often with rather generous support from the state and local regions, not always depending on the local in quite the same way that our country does. And we're in touch with those properties. Haas is in touch with those people. What I think we now excel at is the fact that we have created this network, and the networking abroad is much more a volunteer activity. Sort of email lists, of people who run properties, talking to one another and sharing that way. And occasionally there is a big symposium or something of that sort. But Haas is looks very formal to our European colleagues. They're in admiration of what we've been able to do. And I always think that's what Americans often do very well, because of the way we're constituted as states working within a federal system. We're very good at putting national organization, national like things together. National Park being another great, kind of example of that, and giving them a name and giving them a kind of, if you will, a kind of a logo, a reason for being that we wouldn't get if we didn't have the national organization pulling it all together and making sure that people know what's going on.
So I know you want to give a quick glimpse of a number of these sites, just to give people a sense what you can find within the Historic Artists Homes and Studios Network, and then we'll go deeper on a few select sites.
Yeah, we'll just do a very quick look. So here are 4 sites, very different. Clementine Hunter, an African-American woman who worked at a plantation. Elizabeth Ney, a German artist of the late sort of the 1860s, 70s in Austin, Texas. Frederick Church in Olana, one of the great sites on the Hudson River, and Wharton Eschrick, who created not only the home, but he built every single inch of everything in it as well, furniture maker and designer. Trying to give you some geographic scope here. We have California, the Sun House, Grace Hudson, who was a painter, and particularly the Pomont Indians. George O'Keeffe's home in Abiquiu, we'll come back to. Charlie Russell, a wonderful museum and studio and home. The museum is right on the same grounds as the home and studio. And Sam Maloof, a beautiful furniture maker in Southern California. And then just to say that these properties come in all kinds of varieties, and we'll get into some of that in a second, but let me just say that sometimes they're total creations, such as the Frelinghuysen Morris home, which I would recommend to you in the Berkshires if you ever get to Western Massachusetts, always open during the summer, in particular during high season of Tanglewood and all. But there you have 2 artists, Susie Frelinghuysen and George L.K. Morris, where they created a home like the one they'd seen Corbusier had created for somebody in Paris. And then they went to town doing, you can see the mural on the outside, paintings, and by one or the other, I'm not going to dissect this too much, but they basically did the furniture was sort of an Art Deco character, late Art Deco character, and then they created the furnishings, wall decorations, staircase decorations, and they collected cubism along the way, and you have an experience of a little collection that's quite spectacular as well. Or you take somebody like Donald Judd, a late 20th 20th century minimalist artist who took over that entire 101 Spring Street building, which was an industrial building at one point in Soho, he was a minimalist artist and worked with fellow artists to create these clean spaces, but completely, shaped and gave a totalizing aesthetic that is quite amazing. It's not how most of us live. That's their bedroom. But that's part of what makes so many of these properties fun. They all offer us alternative ways of thinking about domesticity. And just to say, sometimes you use native materials and you shape. This is Russell Wright, whose home is some 65 acres, presently flooded thanks to the rains that New York had. He's near Garrison, New York. But this is he's using the local stone. There's a waterfall on the property, and you can see that he's even let a tree grow up out of, this is an interior space that you're looking at here. Or Warren Esherick. There's great staircases by these people who do furniture. That's one of the great ones by Warren Esherick in his home. And then sometimes, this is very hard to describe without you having the pleasure of seeing one of these homes, but that's when you make your home the work of art that you live in. Just happens that you live in it. And I give you two examples here. One very different. That one's out in the desert. The Noah Purfoy, a campus, I think is what they call it. A artist teacher, African-American artist, but he, in his late life, somewhat, I think, inspired by Watts Tower, which he knew in Los Angeles, began to create out in his homestead, one building and one structure after another that really are gigantic assemblages. And it's just extraordinary. I have not yet seen this site. It's new to Haas, but I've heard from my friends that it is an experience not to be forgotten. And you spend a half a day out there wandering. There's so much to look at. Whereas this artist took a Victorian building in the Mission District of San Francisco and took things that he found in it to create furniture. And these are brooms that he found in the house that he's wearing as a piece of sculpture himself, lighting structures that he created. And it's quite magical. You're like walking into a Cornell box or something. But this is the extreme, if you will, where the house, you forget you're even in a house. It's something so special and so extraordinary and different. And then we're taking special pride in Haas at the numbers of women that we've been able to we continue to add to the membership. And I just give you, it's a spread, and the pictures say who they are. And you can see that they're ceramists and textile workers, and Alice Austin is a wonderful photographer, but lived a difficult life because as a gay woman. And that story is now told very beautifully in the space that she and her partner lived in.
So a chance to go deeper on a select few that I know have been especially meaningful to Wanda. Can you tell us a little bit about this artist environment? And I was struck earlier today with you in the Fitzgerald studio by the paint spatter on the floor, and maybe that's a leitmotif of our conversation.
Yeah. Well, I thought I picked out, I think we have 3 properties that are very different from one another, because I can't emphasize enough how varied these properties are. This is not a one mold operation. And I think what they all have in common is something very different than going to a museum. Let me just say, we might talk about this afterwards, what kind of an experience you have in one of these spaces. I always emphasize 2 words, immersive and sensory. And by those things, I mean, it's immersive in the sense you have to physically get yourself to see one of these homes. And then when you get there, you have to walk through and experience it. Very often you're walking grounds as well as walking in a building. And your senses are all operating, whether it's touch or smell or looking out windows. And I can't get over how different the experiences can be. I'd like to categorize the strength of this experience in two different ways. I always say there's both the romance of visiting a special space, something special has happened, and then these spaces are always archives. That is, they always tell us something about what happened in that particular space, about that artist perhaps, or about the art on an island and a time on an island, so that they have both qualities, the emotional, if you will, the kind of wow factor. Very often, wow, Grant Wood made American Gothic in a space, and also sometimes even more so the archival one of teaching you specialty things. So I would just point this out, that when you go to see the Pollock house, first of all, you have to get on a ferry. You guys do this all the time to get over to Long Island, East Hampton. And then you drive and drive and drive and drive. And so one thing you're noticing is that you're getting very far away from New York City, which is where his active agents were working for him and where he was having his exhibitions, and where he's also being tortured, but to make more paintings and continue to be the artist sort of prodigy that the critics had all claimed him to be. So you're beginning to realize that he chose this space partially to get away from all that. And then secondly, the modesty of the space. That's the home and that's the studio. And the studio is just behind the house. You would go right by these on Long Island. You pass them by without thinking twice about it. They look so common and everyday. And they are indeed inside that home. It's a home with bedrooms on the second floor and a living room and dining room and a kitchen on the first floor. Couldn't be more. It's capacious, but there's nothing really that kind of hits you. There's no big wow factor. Let's put it that way. Then you go into this barn. And again, you can't think of any, it's a most ordinary building, and you walk in and then the wow happens, because you're allowed to put on little booties, and you are allowed to go into the studio where Jackson Pollock made his great big abstractions that he made by, pouring and using implements to throw paint on canvas, and basically created a kind of abstraction that no one had ever seen before, and made them on the floor of the barn that he had turned into his studio. And his wife, Lee Krasner, followed him. So I don't want to, because she took over the studio after he died, and he died quite early, and it became her studio. She's there, and this is him making one of these works in this very famous picture. Well, the wow factor is, and I suppose you might not have the wow factor if you don't think his paintings are pretty good. But if you think they're as extraordinarily innovative as they are, you're in that, again, the space where it all happened. But secondly, you can't get over how small it is. It's only 21 by 21 feet. And you can see the size of the canvas that he's working on. And there you can see how little space there is between the edge of the canvas and thing. So you get a sense of scale. And you get a sense that he could envision what this would be like once he took it out of this tiny little space and put it on the walls of a museum. So you can get a sense of a kind of creativity by standing in this space. And of course, everybody gets off making their own little abstractions of the drops of paint on the wall, on the floor, excuse me, which is what that gentleman is doing. And there's a wonderful pictorial history of the way both of them use this particular studio. So this is a case where it's really what is all happens in that studio space, that even though they also educate you greatly in the home, they use the walls for a gallery exhibition every summer, just like you use your studio for the Fitzgerald studio for an exhibition. They do exactly the same thing. So the archival, if you will, experience is happening within the house. So that's one kind of an experience. Then there's this. Yeah. This could not be more different. Will actually was a curator here, so he should really be talking about it. But I'll just do my quick little tale. We have a lot to thank Olana for, because it's really the first major American artist studio that came to the attention of art historians and dealers when it was imperiled and perhaps going to be sold and developed even, right?
Every object in the collection tagged for sale at Park Burnett Galleries. It was a very near miss.
Yeah. And it is, if you haven't had a chance to go see it on the Hudson, you really must make it a destination stop. In fact, I encourage you to think of Artist Homes and Studios as a way of seeing this country. They are great destination stops. And this has just improved by leaps and bounds over the last 40, 50 years. When we first saw it, it wasn't open to the public yet, and we were able to go up and stand way up there on the top of that tower and see these extraordinary views. And that's one wow factor, just looking at the views and knowing, if you know what his paintings are like, you know that he painted those views. That is very specific inspiration from the natural landscape that lands squarely in his work of art. We could talk a great deal about his influences. This is a high Victorian building. He had traveled in the East, so it's got Persian elements and Near Eastern elements, as well as Victorian stylists, pieces of style. But what I wanted to just make a point is, you could look at the next one, is what happens when you step inside Olana. A lot of people gag because here's a man who didn't have a space he didn't want to fill, and he went traveling all around the world. He was a world traveler, and he brought back things, whether it's China or tools and paintings and extraordinary metalwork and so on. But I found, once I really settled down to think about Olana as a home, I found the way he organized the house helped me understand a painting like that. That's a very large painting that looks like a postage stamp here, because I began to appreciate, for instance, the way he layered his paintings between, there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, but also what leads the eye is not only the way those layers take you back into space, but also the way light draws you into his work. And look at the way he's using light. We won't have time to look at this very closely, but he draws you constantly from one room, one space, up the stairs, through beautiful, beautiful fenestration and views from one filled space to the next. He hardly believes in doors. He basically believes in big openings between rooms. There's no boxiness to his rooms. And this is when I first got this notion of the lived aesthetic, where the painted aesthetic is one way to think about when we talk about his work of art, but he took that same way of creating space and creating drama and creating the lust to keep moving in, as you have in the picture, but the same is true of his home. You just can't wait to get to the next room to see what next kind of fantasy of furnishings and textures and things he's going to present you with. So it's quite extraordinary in the way I think it helps you, teach you about the art too. People often think that there's just too much biography that's being told here and not enough about what came out of the artist studio. But I think that with most of these cases, you can make a direct link and learn things from the space that very often helps you understand the art better. Winslow Homer. Have we had some Winslow Homer visitors here? Anybody gotten there? Oh, not too many of you. That's not too far away, you know. It's in Maine, Trout's Neck, but you do have to make reservations through the Portland Art Museum. And it's one of the beautiful examples of a museum saving a historic property. The Portland Museum, under the leadership of earlier director, just decided this was an endangered property. And I had actually written an article about endangered artist homes and studios in '98, and this was one of my key examples. I had seen it and it looked exactly like you see it there, because that's my picture with its plastic furniture. And that was somewhere in the probably early '90s that I saw it. It was held by family members, but they had various family members own pieces of the property. A couple of people were involved in the home, and it was kind of a difficult set of logistics to basically figure out how to buy the property out from the family, which the museum managed brilliantly to do, and to raise a great deal of money in order to make this happen. And then the Portland Museum did a superb job on restoring the building using all the science of historic buildings that they could bring to bear. So this is the way it looks more or less today. And what you can do is you make a reservation through the Portland Museum, and you spend half a day on your little journey going from the museum to the property, because just a few people can go at any one time. In any case, the wow factor here is interesting to talk about, because this is a building where we don't have any furnishings. People often ask me whether you have to have a lot of art and you have to have a lot of furnishings. And I said, well, that always helps. The more history you can bring to bear on structure, the better. But occasionally, and this is one good instance, there's nothing more than an easel, some built-in furniture, there's a couple of little extraneous pieces, and then he signed, this is very touching to see, he signed, I don't know whether it's Winslow Homer or just W. Homer. He etched into the glass in the window. And it has, his studio is the little structure to the right there. And what's so very interesting about that is the windows are all, this is facing the water. We are the water where you all are sitting. And the studio has windows facing the water, but the wall facing the road has no windows whatsoever. He was not interested in people peering through his windows. He lived here for some 20 odd years when he was rather famous as an artist. And he did not want to be interfered with in terms of using this as a creative haven. And then what makes this so special is that you go in and you can stand on that balcony. And of course, you're looking at the water, which we can show you this next picture. You're basically, this looks rather familiar to you all. This is not unlike what you look at every day. But it's pretty special to be able to just walk down your front yard. And in this case, it's accessible. You're not at a height. You can get right out on those rocks. And paintings like this by Homer, especially paintings that he did during the last part of his career, these great solitary single bursting waves. And this is as good as I could get my day there in trying to find a bursting wave, and it's nowhere near as good as his. But there's where I think that there's something quite, it's almost inexplicably sensuous to be able to see what he was looking at every day, and to know what he was able to do with it, which is not something that's very ordinary.
We're getting close to the end of our time, and we have some really rich case studies still to discuss. And I just wanted to say for folks on the line, if you do have any questions, feel free to answer them in the Q&A function. Folks in the room, we will have time for a few questions at the end, but let's be sure to talk about this special place that's been very important to watch.
Yeah, well, okay, mindful of time, I'm going to be quick on Miss O'Keefe, Georgia O'Keefe's home. This is her home in Abiquiu. She had two homes in northern New Mexico. The large home she put together and recreated on the footprint of a former hacienda in the late 40s after her husband Alfred Stieglitz had died, and she knew that she was going to move out of New York, where she spent part of her year, and permanently live in New Mexico. She had a smaller home there that she used as a summer place. And this was her beautiful creation. And she spent the rest of her life basically fiddling with it, putting in more and more picture windows, more and more corner picture windows. This space is her studio space. There it is, set up as her studio when she was alive. That's the way it was set up when she was older and no longer able to paint. Anyway, it's an extraordinary story, and as I'll just tell you that once Michael Kimmelman wrote an article about having seen this for the first time, and he ended the article saying he thought it was her greatest work of art yet, which was high praise. And I've heard other people say things like, I never could understand Georgia O'Keeffe's New Mexico paintings as opposed to maybe her flower paintings earlier, but once I saw that house, I got it. It's again the lived aesthetic, the aesthetic of the house, its simplicity, which maybe we could look at the next picture to see the simplicity at work. Let's skip this one for a minute.
Okay. Trying to get this raised hand to go away. Sorry, that's hovering over our screen. Lower hand. There we go. Sorry about that. Next one.
Yeah, this is the way her sitting room looked, and that's one of her picture windows that she put in very late in life because she wanted that beautiful tree to be framed. And I learned so much about her from these spaces. But the minimalism, including putting very few things on the walls. But these are spaces where the best I could, I suppose, point out is that she had a great stereo system because she loved classical music, but you would never find a picture, you wouldn't find a book lying on that. That table was always clean. She had a kind of less is more aesthetic inside the house. It's quite extraordinary. But also the other thing I might point out, the more I got studying her arrangement, she did a lot of bought a lot of mid-century modern furniture by big names and so on, like the pieces that you see here. But she always set them up as if they're set up for at least two people, but not more. In other words, it was, and I'm going to just segue to this in a moment, but she set it up. She sat in that chair, she would sit on that banquette, and occasionally one or two other people would be with her, but they would never look like what you see here, except for one instance, which is something that I happened to be a part of. I took this picture, but when she died, there was an effort to try to understand what to do with her legacy and her buildings. She had considered leaving her home to the National Park Service. She had also considered it again to leaving it with the National Trust, but none of these things had come to pass. And when she died, the Park Service was sort of ordered by, I believe, the senator of New Mexico to look into whether should it be a national park? I mean, the national park does have two great properties, St. Gaudens home and also the J. Alden Weir farm in Connecticut. So it's not totally outside their purview. So this gathering and the people that are visiting virtually that are art historians are going to, I challenge you to find who you know in this picture. But this gathering is a bunch of scholars basically trying to figure out what might happen with the home and so on. And so that's Neil, for those of you that know your scholars, that's Neil Harris. David Curry is back here, and behind David, that's David, and behind that is Liz Glassman. And many of these other younger faces are National Park workers at the time trying to figure it out. But this looked totally, as I came to know Miss O'Keefe, and I had interviewed her in a space like this, this looked so odd because she never had big groups ever come visit. One or two people, three or four max, would be visiting her at any one time. In any case, long story short, the two homes now belong to the O'Keefe Museum. There now is an O'Keefe Museum. That's what the long-term solution was to the O'Keefe problem, that she had no presence in New Mexico when she died. That is, she was underrepresented in the museums there. And that's a very happy story. And you can visit the Abiquiu home again through a procedure of making a reservation and taking a little jitney from a particular visitor's site, and you can have an experience of your lifetime. It takes a couple of hours to do it. You have to drive an hour or so out of Santa Fe to get there, but that's part of the experience. You drive from and that's what that earlier picture was about. You drive from this busy urban town and you just go out into a no man's land of extraordinary landscape, and you realize what it would have meant for her to choose that place to live so far away from a mega center and dirt roads all the way during her early years there and so on. So it's an extraordinary experience.
So we should bring this full circle and to a close with Monhegan and with the sites that you saw today. There are so many fascinating artist environments on this island, and one of the most interesting of those stories is the buildings designed and built by the artist Rockwell Kent. Such a varied and international career, and we're so fortunate to have a piece of that story here with all of these buildings, but two in particular that are now part of the Monhegan Museum that Wanda visited for the first time today. So we could run through their history, detail their ownership changes over the years. The one at bottom right might be a useful final case study here, but I'm especially eager. Sure. This is a group of buildings contributed to Monhegan Island by Rockwell Kent himself, and then used by a number of other artists, including Alice Kent Stoddard and James Fitzgerald. And so we have a specialist in artist environments with us on Monhegan Island today, who's seeing these spaces for the first time in all this context that you've heard, from New Mexico to Montana and even to the Low Countries, these European examples as well. So I'm curious what you see, and in this case, the Ken Fitzgerald studio.
Well, I did get to visit today, and Dan, thank you very much for my touring and,
There you go.
and giving us a history of this structure, which is so extraordinary. And I guess I would say a few things that makes it very special. It's a relatively, well, it's not a brand new member of Haas, but it's one of our newer properties since that map was made, for instance, that we looked at earlier. And I'm struck by several things. One is we have a couple of other properties like this, but they are of an earlier era, like Impressionism, American Impressionism, and that is a property that has served more than one artist, that has a history of layered ownership and use. And that makes for a richer history to tell with the structure. But it also, you know, who was saying that Monhegan is, who said it, an artist's home and studio? That's a beautiful metaphor, it seems to me. And in a way, this is it in a microcosm. You can tell the history of Monhegan through this one structure, and the way in which art has been such a vital presence on this island, an identifier, and you know, it gives you, it's what gives you your grist and your everyday energy here. It seems to me, is the number of art travelers that are here, as well as the people seeking nature, and seeking to sort of be in a place where time stops for a little bit. And I think that's what I felt in a way. When I was in the studio today, that time did stop for a moment. A cell phone would seem totally out of keeping with this environment that I was in, and I enjoyed particularly the kind of, it's kind of a stripped down space because it was a summerish. It was used during good weather, and it has a beautiful patina to it. The paint is old. The structure is, you know, of a vintage. It obviously has changed over the years, but I think thinking of Monhegan as a kind of colony, kind of a Greenwich Village of the summer type, is a very valuable way to think about what goes on in this island. And to have a space like this where several generations have gone through it is telling somewhat the story of your space here, your place, and that's very special. Not many studios have that ability to tell the story quite the same way. So I felt it was kind of a classic story in that it's a home, and then there's the studio. We have, just like Pollock and Krasner, we have several properties that are like that, and that is obviously one mode of making an artist's life. You make the house the social space, and you make the studio the quiet, private workspace. And that can happen. The workspace can be pristine and rather tidy, the way this one is, or they can get very messy. Sculptor spaces tend to be very crowded spaces, and a painter space tends to be cleaner, and so on. So
I should share that these images you're seeing of the two properties are taken from the very useful virtual tour that both folks on the island and folks far away can take on the virtual tour section of the Monhegan Museum website to click through the house and studio and think about what it would be like to inhabit this environment, how it would shape creative practice, what it feels like to live with that outsized presence of Rockwell Kent in later generations. And then last but not least, this Rockwell Kent structure built for his mother that we were fortunate to get to see a bit of today. Any reflections on that fascinating built environment of our Monhegan artist history?
It's a great painting.
Yeah.
We didn't get down there,
yeah.
but we were up there. And just to imagine looking at that this house from down here. Well, there's a vista not to be missed. that we were very fortunate to be able to experience today. I just would say that Kent's story has a lot of Monhegan in it, and it's important that you tell that story.
There we go. Well said. And maybe that's a good note to end on. So I think I will stop screen share, and then we'll want to shut down our projector so you don't just see our faces on the big screen as well as the small one. Let's see if I can figure out how to do that. Can you the other slide? There we go. Okay, so now we can see each other properly in the room. Folks at home, if the camera was not behaving the whole time, now you can see who was talking. We are all gathered here together. I see some questions have come in on the virtual one, but maybe I'll give our privileged in-person audience the chance. Or yeah, lights up would be great, I think, so we can see each other. Any questions from the room to start, and then I'll see what we've got online. Anyone want to kick us off? No. I've got plenty, but I'm going to try to defer to others for time here. Here we go. This has been a topic of conversation in recent days. Thank you from Patrick Lucas. Could you talk a bit about the endangered Henry Tanner House in Philadelphia? And this is something that we've been learning about from another person in the room, a proud citizen of the Philadelphia art world in attendance, Dr. Kathy Foster in the front row. It is already a National Historic Landmark, which is under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service, right? Is Haas et al. Interested in the Henry Tanner House and contributing to its support? And if Kathy wants to say a word, you're welcome as well. But yeah.
Yes. No, I think we should say that Haas is very much in conversation with the Tanner family members that are working to save that house and to open it for perhaps public activities or some kind of community use. It's more stories than just Henry Tanner, the artist. It's stories of also other members of the very high achieving Tanner family in Philadelphia. Most importantly, if those of you here know that the National Trust every year does 10 or 11 endangered structures across the country, that they're hoping they can appeal to people who might help save these structures. The Tanner was one of those on this year's list. So perhaps, Patrick, that's what even got your attention. But I think the very fact that we got the trust to put it on the list, Haas was very instrumental. The director was very instrumental in putting that property there. So I think it's on our bandwidth.
Do you want to say more? Okay. One question, I wonder if Dan might know the answer to this. We have curiosity about other layers of Monhegan artists interacting with the ex-Rockwell Kent houses. Randall Davey is a name well known to Monhegan art fans. Did he also rent a house that has a Rockwell Kent provenance? Does that ring any bells? Doesn't ring any bells for me. Okay. I'm sorry, Kim Strauss, we don't know the answer to your very interesting question. Yeah, we'll keep an eye out. Rosemary Kennett asks another good question about an elephant in the room, about which we can't say too much more. Any news on Wyatt's house? Stay tuned. We'll see. Let's see. Any questions from the room? Yes, please.
On balance, is federal funds and help for how complicated?
Yes.
Let me repeat that question just in case. On balance, is federal funding for sites like these a help or a hindrance?
Well, it's not available. So I can't even say that. I can't say from experience anything about that. It's, saving historic buildings in this country's got an interesting history. If it has to do with presidents and wars, we apply federal funding, and the national. I have to say, National Park Service is, of course, one of our great feats federally, and we're the envy of the world for our National Park Service. But we do not get federal funding for any of what we do. Occasionally, our sites will apply for NEA or NEH grants. Our specific sites, they do that on their own, because each one of our sites is really on its own budget and on its own personnel. What they can do, and this is where Haas is very useful. Haas not only gives them a brochure, this is the latest brochure.
I think we have some by the door if you're interested.
Yeah. So, and Haas also has some ability now to do re-grantings. So if you need a $10,000 roof, or you need a digital program, particularly we're interested in helping them do digital programming. because our sites very often don't have the personnel or the funds to do that. But one thing that Haas is able to do is through a proposal and review of those proposal, selection process, small grants are being given to the individual properties to do these things, but it's not federal money. It's basically mostly it's money from foundations or by now increasingly patrons who really love what we're doing and want to help us. And that's music to our ears. We have been funded, Haas has been funded primarily by the Luce Foundation and the Wyeth Foundation. The Luce Foundation is an arts foundation and gives significant money to all kinds of projects, museum exhibitions, rehangings of permanent collection, conservation of works of art and so on. And Wyeth does the same without quite the same kind of resources, but nevertheless, Wyeth has been very, very important to the recent history, particularly of Haas. And Jamie Wyeth has been a great supporter of Haas. He gets the importance of artist spaces and he loves creating them, and he creates pretty amazing spaces himself. So he's a great
provide funding to the museum here and houses here, for which we're very grateful.
That was an additional word for folks on the line from the person the series is named for, Professor Ed Deci, underlining the important support Monhegan's museum and artist sites have received from the Wyeth Foundation for American Art. Yeah.
Wanda, is there a handbook to the?
Oh, what happened to that picture? I'm sorry. We do have a guidebook, and I'm sorry, we had a photograph of it, but it kind of
Yeah,
disappeared.
We do have
Thank
Valerie
you
on the
for that
line, by the
lead
way.
question.
The author of that handbook is on. Thank you, Valerie, for sending a word. She was especially pleased to hear the shout out to Alice Kent Stoddard. So one of the key people behind the scenes at Haas is enjoying the presentation. Yeah.
So there is, I guess, a guidebook that, do you sell it here at Monhegan?
Don't know.
Have it at the museum.
Is it in
You
the
have it
museum?
in the
Sorry, yeah,
museum. Okay, good. In any case, I highly recommend it to you for your car, you know, because when you go someplace, you can actually look up and see if there happens to be within a 50-mile radius, an artist studio you might be able to visit.
Yeah.
It needs to be updated because I think we had 36 properties or something when we did it, and now we have many more. So it isn't totally up to date, but that's the nature of books. You can, however, go on the website, and the website is trying to stay very up to date. We will hopefully in the next 6 months have a brand new kind of presentation, but I highly recommend, if this interests you, you don't even have to do the whole words, just put down artists, homes and studios and up it will pop, and you'll see the membership and you'll see the activities that are each of the sites supports and does. You'll be amazed at the variety.
On the topic of support for these sites, we have a useful contribution from my colleague Jan Bianco at the Farnsworth Art Museum, who reminds us of the important impact Ruth Kohler has had on artist sites, especially not so far away from here in Maine. I believe she's a key driver of the Bernard Langley site, so aka Blackie Langley. So all kinds of other efforts far and wide by that family. Thank you for joining us, Jane. Folks tuning in, curators from Chicago and former directors of the Farnsworth. This is proof that Haas brings people together. We might not be able to get to all these questions. I saw another hand or two in the room. Let's see if we can get to one or two more. Please, back there first.
I'm just curious. I was at the final years ago in Robert Indiana's house.
Yes.
Very interesting building. I know his house since then. Is there any interest?
Let me repeat the question for folks on the line. Any progress, any insight into the fate of Robert Indiana's house?
I'm not totally up to date, but there has been great interest in preserving that home. I don't know if you got inside, but
My friend did.
Yeah.
And, we actually saw him sneak in after the very end of his life. I've heard stories of it.
yeah.
You know, a floor full of stuffed animals and
Yeah, he liked
dog and
giraffes,
Giraffes.
lots of giraffes. One thing, many artists are collectors, and he was one of them. Not all artists, again, but many are collectors. And his specialty were these big stuffed animals. We had a wonderful day in that studio and home, and had a wonderful time with him. But you know, sometimes people collect very quirky things. You're very surprised by what you're going to find. But that's, again, I think one of the reasons people like to go to artist homes and studios, because they see alternative ways of living than their own or their friends. And so I don't know that the current state of the Indiana estate. There has been, you know, tremendous, there's been a lot of litigation and contestation of the will, and I'm not up to date, but I'm understanding that it's coming to an end, is what I've been told. Now, I don't know what an end will be in terms of the studio. It's not a studio, it's a home that also included the studio. It's what was the name of the yeah, Vinyl Haven, but what was the name of the Odd Fellows? It's an Odd Fellows home, a building. It's 5 stories. It has 4 or 5 stories. It's very, very large house. But I hope it can be. I hope the locals will make it a project. I don't know. Usually, most of these start just like your project started. They start with flame keepers, people who will keep who know something about the artist and how important that artist was to them and that space was made to them. And I think Indiana has a lot of support for that space being made into some kind of something or other, whether it'll be a community structure or a public visitation, I'm not sure.
We are well over time with all of our enthusiasm for the insights that Professor Coleman has shared with us today. Thank you for being with us in person on this beautiful night on Monhegan Island. Thanks to the 100+ people who joined us remotely, and this has been recorded and will be shared later. So this starts an annual series for the Monhegan Museum celebrating Ed Deci's legacy, bringing voices like Professor Wanda Coleman to Monhegan Island. Thank you for being a part of it, and stay tuned. Thank you, Wanda.